So we're here at Tall Timbers Research Station, and in front of the Beetle House. Beetle was the benefactor for Tall Timbers. He operated this property, our little over 4,000 acre property, as really a pleasuring ground, a place to hunt that was very characteristic and still is of this 300,000 acre area of the Red Hills. He was very interested in applied science and how science could help the management of these properties, and in particular bobwhite quail, but really more broadly in how fire interacted with vegetation. And so he and our founders, Herbert Stoddard, who was a dear colleague of Leopold. Leopold visited Tall Timbers. Stoddard visited the shack. They worked on some of the earliest game management in America that would turn into wildlife biology. And they were interested in the effects of management activities on game animals and also non-game animals. They're both eminent naturalists. And this porch has seen, imagine the stories and the discoveries that they have discussed. So when Tall Timbers was founded in 1958, this became the brief headquarters here to the right, and this grew into Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy, where we're focused on the Red Hills region, but also from a fire perspective, national and international fire policy and actionable science. Tall Timbers is a little unique in that it's a private research station, but that we work really closely. We're located next to Tallahassee, and so we're involved in with the state of Florida and state of Georgia. Our property goes a little bit into South Georgia. Very involved in state level game management, biodiversity conservation, and also from a science perspective, we're working to focus on game birds, primarily bobwhite quail, focusing on non-game birds. The recovery of the red-cockaded woodpecker is a primary pursuit, and then in the ecological response to fire, whether it's here in the Red Hills or internationally. The buzz in management and science, in particular with fire and silviculture, is this concept of co-production, where managers and scientists work together on a problem. The scientist is observing, forming hypotheses, implementing research, but the link to management issues has always been what Tall Timbers has done, and federal agencies and scientists have now discovered the value in that, and that's something that we really hold dear and is a part of all the research that we do. So we're here in classic Red Hills of North Florida and South Georgia, open pine savanna. The overstory trees here are a fluctuating mixture of longleaf pine, shortleaf pine, and loblolly pine. And really, depending on where you are in the image, you'll see a patch of one or the other. They're relatively mixed. They're all really fire-tolerant pines, and the area in our view is burned on a biennial basis. Every 2 years, surface prescribed fire comes through, and so the species that are here have to be able to tolerate the intensity that those fires generate. And this is a pretty classic image of the Red Hills. You see it's obviously uneven aged, and the structure is really diverse. Management is focused on northern bobwhite or bobwhite quail, but as you can hear, there are a lot of other birds that are here right now. This is a site with a lot of red-cockaded woodpeckers, federally listed bird that's a major topic of management, a major focus of management on a lot of federal lands, and also here in this Red Hills region. But really, it's kind of a rough soundtrack because the cacophony of birds this morning. Bluebirds are like crazy. We might see a red-cockaded woodpecker in a minute, but this is a really classic shot. You can see the dominance in the understory of grasses and a little bit of woody cover, and this is providing perfect habitat for a ground nester like bobwhite quail, but also incredible habitat for a host of other game and non-game species, endangered species, all the way to species that are real focuses of game management. So we're here in a upland mixed pine savanna in North Florida. This is a pretty characteristic stand for this area we call the Red Hills, South Georgia and North Florida. A mixture of shortleaf pine, loblolly pine, and longleaf pine, and really across the site you can see clusters of each. The characteristic they share is they're all really fire adapted. They're able to tolerate the fire regime that is used here for a variety of purposes. All those species share a common list of traits. They all have really thick bark. They tend to prune themselves rapidly, and you can see out here not a lot of low branches. Those low branches would be in the heat generated by the fire, and so that's a dangerous spot to allocate resources. But this is a pretty characteristic landscape. Our goal generally for these lands is about a 60 square foot basal area. And in the view here, you can see areas that are pretty dense, that are probably holding 100 or so, and then other areas that are wide open. They're truly savannas that are in, probably approaching single digits from a basal area standpoint. This is a perfect habitat for a lot of those species that transition between, sort of upland grassland to lightly covered forest. And managing lands like this generates that perfect sort of habitat. So you can see the variation in the patchiness of this forest. And this, from a management standpoint, this offers a lot of challenges. It's gorgeous to look at, which is important. And that's a major objective of the private landowners here, because they're enjoying these lands for hunting, or they're enjoying these lands for just enjoying these lands. But from a hunting standpoint, particularly for bobwhite quail, you have to have an open view. And so to have that open view and to have the herbaceous component really pushing these to such an open overstory is a real challenge. So you're keeping the density very low, the stocking is very low, and then also at the same time keeping in mind that you need regeneration. And so to establish pines, even fire-adapted pines in a system like this is always a challenge, and it creates a bit of a conundrum from a management standpoint. And so the managers in this region, a 300,000 acre region, they're all burning about the same. They're focusing on a biennial fire return interval, plus or minus. Some burn annually, some wait 3 or 4 years, depending on the objectives. But in all of those, there's always a mind for regeneration. And one of the tricks of the trade here is using ground disturbance to protect patches of seedlings in large openings, like the large gap that's here behind me. That's an area to catch seedlings, and then to let those seedlings be fire protected for a couple of burns. Most of these pines, shortleaf can resprout. Longleaf will use its characteristic grass stage to invest resources below ground and then have rapid vertical growth to get out of that fire sensitive zone. And loblolly will struggle in those systems. Its strategy is grow tall as fast as you can. And so those are patterned out throughout the woods, as you'll see in these different images. And then you can see older patches that have grown up, and they're now established poles that are making their way into the overstory. I think this high structural diversity generated by frequent burning, intervals of tree removals that are focused on maintaining the aesthetic, this is the real characteristic Red Hills management. In these burn interval plots, this is the unburned. The underlying soils, the underlying environment is the same. It's just this site hasn't burned in now 60 years. So you can see the same overstory, at least the overstory dominants are the same pines. They're loblolly, shortleaf, and scattered longleaf. But the composition of the midstory and some of the now overstory trees is it's a pretty dramatic shift. You can see a lot of water oak, black cherry, the sort of the typical invaders, a little bit of sweet gum, and you also see what would be considered the climax for this region without fire, without disturbance, and that's southern magnolia peeking in with its large, really shade-tolerant leaves. There are a few things, beyond seeing the same pines and in a relatively similar arrangement. They're a little thicker, obviously, but the most striking difference is the loss of the herbaceous cover. You can hear birds outside the plot that are pretty characteristic of the upland games, but in the plot, this is sort of backyard birds. The mammal community very different, etc. And these areas are really common throughout the southeast, formerly frequently burned, and then a cessation of burning, whether for a fire suppression policy, or in this case, this is a research burn. But arguably, these sites are throughout the country, throughout the world. Little fire excluded patches, sometimes fire excluded landscapes. From a restoration standpoint, which is a really common management focus, this is a really difficult area to restore. You still have the overstory dominance, and so you don't have to recreate those or plant them. But in order to reduce this organic forest floor, it's a real challenge. It's a classic management conundrum. It's easy to burn this. The flames are not going to be, it won't be a crown fire in these systems. It would be a relatively low intensity surface fire, but it would also be a ground fire. So burning across the litter surface would ignite the forest floor beneath, and those fuels as a ground fuel would smolder. And if you look out into the stand, you can see mounds of forest floor around individual pines, and those mounds are occupied by pine roots. And when those fuels smolder, they burn, that really slow smoldering rate. They're still generating a lot of heat. They cause injury in the roots or outright kill them, and then the tree is standing without an ability to cool itself off. So we're now in of these upland plots that are burned with different intervals. This is a plot that hasn't burned in 60 years. This is our unburned plot. And you can notice a few things in this site. The overstory pines are still here, and you still see that same mixture of shortleaf pine, loblolly pine, and longleaf pine. They're in a little bit more dense as far as their overstory structure. They haven't suffered fire-caused mortality over the years. But what is really striking is the other species that are here, and that's in this case water oak, black cherry, and then what would be the climax for this region, the most shade tolerant, southern magnolia, with its really shade tolerant leaves. And that this is following that's classical successional pathway toward a climax. The most striking difference, maybe not is that hardwood component, but is the lack of herbaceous species. So that really high density herbaceous and really diverse cover that's present in the frequently burned plots is absent here. And it's replaced with an organic forest floor, a true forest floor here, that is pretty deep and causes a lot of problems from a restoration standpoint, not to mention that they literally blanket the understory. They prevent the establishment and the persistence of that diverse herbaceous layer that serves as the cover, the food, etc., for all the animals that we're managing for in this landscape. This condition is pretty common throughout the southeast. Fire excluded for decades. In this case, it's It's 60 years without fire. But from a restoration standpoint, this site, it still has the overstory pines, and so it's not a clean slate. And so in some ways, you already have the 100-year-old overstory. You just need to get the understory back. But it actually offers a lot of challenges from a management standpoint. During that period, that immediate post-fire, acute, and chronic period, they're prone to beetle attack, and if there's a drought or other difficult situations, in this case, a lot of other competition, they'll die. And so in a lot of areas with a very noble intent to restore fire to these systems, the outcome is pretty substantial overstory mortality. And I think this is a pretty classic area, whether it's white fir in the Sierras or in this area with hardwoods invading what was an open pine savanna. This is what 60 years looks like in this area. You notice the pines, in particular, they'll have a mound of forest floor around them. And those mounds of forest floor are organic material, and they're overlying the sandy soils that are here and form a pretty dramatic boundary. The pines will grow into those organic mounds, and their roots will proliferate. And when fire is reintroduced, whether wildfire or an intentional, with all the best intentions, prescribed fire, it'll burn across the surface as a really low intensity surface fire, and then that heat will ignite the underlying organic material, and it will smolder. And sometimes it'll smolder for hours or days following ignition, and the pine roots that have grown into that will be injured or killed, causing the tree to have a immediate post-fire stress, not able to cool itself off, and not able to move water to recover. In addition to that, they have to regrow those roots, and so it takes a large carbohydrate store and concentrates the carbohydrate demand to building new fine roots to be able to serve as uptake for nutrients and for water. If you dig into these, and this is pretty classic wherever you go, I haven't dug at this one yet, but I'm pretty sure what it looks like. You get to this classic duff here. Beyond the superficial litter, you'll build this, depending on the site, sometimes it's multiple inches. This is relatively shallow in this spot, but you'll have this layer of organic material that serves as a ground fuel, not a surface fuel. And invariably, here I've got some smilax, a shrub, and then invariably you'll have this. Here's a pine root, and those pine roots are sitting here at the surface in a really, a very difficult spot if fire occurs, because this little pine root is connected to lots of other pine roots. And if I move around, I'll find pine roots all through here. And thinking about clipping a few pine roots is not a big issue, but because of this entire mound has a proliferation of fine roots, and also coarse roots, and whatever is severed here at the base, everything out running away from the tree is also severed. And so it's a pretty massive loss. And we've shown some pretty convincing research showing the tremendous carbohydrate drain that occurs following it, and what happens in those situations because of those stresses. If it's a droughty year following fire, that is hard for us to predict. If bark beetles are around, they will smell and sense the injuries, or in this case, with a lot of other competition, you tend to suffer double-digit mortality, sometimes in excess of 70 or 80%. The large trees with the most mounding of forest floor duff are the ones that take it the hardest. So this is a classic restoration conundrum. When what seemingly would be a very simple fire is missing, put fire back in, ends up being a really complicated restoration mission. So the early scientists at Tall Timbers were really focused on understanding the lightning fire regime, sort of pre-human fire regime. And lightning is obviously frequent, but lightning that coincides with fuels sufficiently dry to ignite and to spread is a little more rare in the southeast. In the west, that's certainly not the case. We don't have the same sort of dry lightning here. But lightning does start fires, and the interesting part of it is it really covers, or it touches on, the fragmentation of these landscapes, because a single lightning fire for us that would ignite in Tallahassee, Florida, would be relatively unimpeded until it hit the Gulf of Mexico, or relatively unimpeded until it hit Atlanta or Charlotte. Those fires could spread across these flammable landscapes. And it's just in something like this that becomes less flammable, but then when it is flammable, burns with higher intensity, it's much more complicated. Here we have a lightning regime that has 10 to 20 or 30,000 years of native burning, with a couple hundred years of primarily European and also African burning. And we have a good idea that Native American burning was also really, really frequent, and so the annual unit probably looks a lot like, if you were trying to manage something so that you minimized your exposure to wildfires, if you were trying to maximize food production for the animals that you were hunting and the species you're probably cultivating, those annual regimes and biennial regimes certainly work. Something like this, scattered across a landscape is not a big issue, but if you imagine this blanketing a landscape, it would be a pretty dramatic reduction for us. For biodiversity, if this was my food source, my hunting source, and the place I was living, you can imagine all of the complications. But lightning in the southeast, very frequent. Florida is the lightning capital of North America. But again, these individual lightning strikes that in the opposite, I just gave the Tallahassee to Charlotte, it could ignite in Charlotte and burn all the way to Tallahassee as well. It's pretty easy for fire to jump rivers. In the native landscape, there were likely lots of small patchy agriculture that controlled fire spread, but they were certainly supplementing, and in some places probably dominating, the fire regime with their own application of fire. And that's always it's a difficult something to wrap your head around from a management standpoint. Usually we're objective driven, whether it's silviculture or fire. We're trying to burn or treat to get to something, and most of those things, open stand structure, high quality logs, ease of access, game habitat, reducing wildfire hazard, that long list of characters and aesthetics, they usually move to something like, in this case, the lightning fire regime, or that Native American and mixed with lightning fire regime. And so they really converge on that sort of really, really frequent fire. All right, in this series of interval burning, we go from an annual burn regime all the way to the no burn in 60 years, and we're standing now in the annual fire every year since 1960. And again, the same species are common: shortleaf pine, loblolly pine, and longleaf pine. Their density is further reduced. They've suffered fire cause mortality over the period. And really the most striking difference to me is the herbaceous understory. It's not a mixture of woody and grasses and forbs. It's really grassy and forby. So in the core area of the plot, it's pretty scattered open pine. So what you'll notice in particular along the edges of this unit, as is really common in prescribed fire landscapes, we ignite fire on a fire break, and whether we're backing fire off of that break against the wind with low intensity just to create an area of black so that we can strategically push fire into that area, or we're lighting it as a head fire to burn the interior unburned area, you tend to have really low intensity fire that surrounds the boundaries. And so you end up having species here that are characteristic of, that don't have the traits that enable them to survive frequent fire because the fires were pretty low intensity. That's a really common occurrence in a lot of prescribed burn landscapes. The interior of the unit meets our target, the edges of the unit don't. And so in these landscapes, people will preferentially pick off edge trees. They'll utilize herbicides to go along with fire, or otherwise acknowledge that those areas are going to be a little bit different. Over time, those areas will create walls, and from a fire behavior standpoint, those walls will impede flow, and so they become a bit of a management issue over time. This area, because of all the diversity, because of the pretty dramatic shift away from woody resprouts, which you can see they're scattered about, but they generally are top killed so rapidly that their regrowth is really constrained. We think this matches or mirrors, it definitely mirrors a lot of early descriptions, a lot of early photographs from the regions, and we know that it provides unparalleled habitat for a really wide diversity of species. So here we are in that succession of burn interval treatments. We have the 1 year, the really frequent fire, 3, 4, and 60 years without. This is the 2 year, and at a really first glance, it looks pretty similar to the annual. You can see a little bit more, some more woody sprouts, and the overstory is the same. It's rinse, wash, repeat. Okay, in this progression of annual all the way to no fire in 60 years, this is the 3 years, 3 years without fire. And, in that sort of ecology of place, the Red Hills area here where we are is really productive. And so this is what 3 years looks like in these systems. These systems are also predominantly what we call old field. They were agriculture in the 19th century, and then they transitioned into overstory pines, and they also have this dominant woody cover of primarily oaks, but sweet gum is a classic. You can see some of the vines and shrubs, the smilax that's really common across all of these. But this is in that picture from the annual that is really grassy. You have a little bit of a forb into a 2 year. In a 3 year, you really start to have the dominance of woody species. And across a lot of national forest lands and other forest lands in the southeast, we use a 2 to 4 year, or a 1 to 5 year, or a 2 to 10, whatever the interval that folks use. Those are really focused on place. For us, a 3 year fire return interval gets this. That's not high quality from game habitat standpoint. It's difficult access. It loses all the biodiversity value of these systems, and so our systems require a 2 year or an annual. If we were to use herbicides in these systems, we could catch up on some of that issue, get away from this sort of, a lot of these species are caught in a resprouting trap. They get this big, and when this site burns in 6 weeks from now, they'll be knocked back and they'll resprout and proliferate, and you can see these little sprout clumps across the unit. And they all get to that, this really shrubby form of a tree. If a fire is patchy, then those little shrubby clumps can grow into overstory trees, and you can see a few species here that have escaped this fire trap. But in general, the overstory looks about like the other overstories. It's the same scattered pines, but again, are relatively degraded from a biodiversity standpoint, and just fundamentally, moving along a negative trajectory for these systems. Has an ability to have fire be pretty effective, but in order to reduce the rootstocks of these individual sprouters, following this sort of fire from a restoration standpoint with really, really frequent fire after would push it back into into that grassy system that is the easiest to burn, the easiest to manage. It offers a lot of management flexibility that sites like this ends up being a struggle. It's a bit of a fight from a management standpoint, with the sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't struggle between hardwood resprouts, not burning it too hot to hurt the overstory trees, etc., which are kind of classic from a fire and silviculture component. There are a few interesting things in this too. This shrubby area here behind me, you will have a couple of things happening. One is the suckering of sand live oak. Much like an aspen, it sends out horizontal runners that emerge as little vertical individuals. If you grab these and pull them up, you can follow it back to the original stump. But it's an interesting strategy. It makes it look like there are a ton of individual seedlings, but in general they're just a clone. The water oak sprouts are also pretty common in here, but it still has the dominant feature, and this is what most of our landscape is managed on, this biennial. It's sort of the perfect mix of a little bit of woody cover, high diversity grass and forb, in areas where the pines can establish. There are also some oaks in these, and all the systems the plot network has the presence of southern red oak, which for us is a pretty fire tolerant oak, accrues bark pretty rapidly and prunes itself pretty rapidly. And then in our systems we also have live oak that as an adult has really, really thick bark. As a juvenile it doesn't, and so it continues to get beat back into these little sprout clumps, but we can retain the large overstory adult over time because they do have that thick bark. They may be picked away at by fire, but here we have 60 years with a fire every other year. The math is that's 30 fires these individual species have survived, and so while a few of those may have been low intensity, probably the same number have been ragers. And so in these systems, those oaks are pretty stable. They occasionally make it out of this little small stature. Again, when fire is patchy, low intensity in a spot, they'll use that to escape. But it's quite the struggle for them to go from sort of knee or even chest high to make it out of that really fire sensitive zone. But this is what the dominant portion of our landscape looks like here, and throughout this 300,000 acres of the Red Hills, this is really the characteristic look. It's sort of, like we say, kind of the best of both worlds, but requiring a tremendous amount of effort. Biennial burning is not trivial. So now we're in the 4 years without fire. The Red Hills region of North Florida and South Georgia is productive. In another socioeconomic period, this would be cotton. It's very productive soils, and so a fire regime that in the Sierra Nevada would be an really open pine with herbaceous ground cover. Here is, as you can see, dominated by woody resprouts, and this is what 4 years of growth generates. A really dense mid-story, providing very different birds, and you can still see the overstory pine scattered almost at the same density that we've been having here. Because it's 4 years, there's 4 years of fuel that accumulates, and so these areas, when they do burn, are more intense. But again, you're lacking, just like you are in the 60 year, you're lacking the herbaceous ground cover. So it's absent of grasses, and it's really just a woody shrub, whether it is tree seedlings like live oak, water oak, or true shrubs like wax myrtle, sparkleberry, etc. So some of the same species just allowed to release a little bit more. This will be burned this year, they'll be knocked back down, and they'll start that recovery. But you won't have the period of high herbaceous diversity that all the species are queuing on. And I think it brings up a couple topics that are relevant, and that are really, fire ecology is and using fire as really a place-based phenomenon. For us, because of the productivity, saying something like we often say, writing management plans, we'll say the fire return interval is based on fire scars is 2 to 10 years, or 2 to 5 years, or 1 to 5 years. But you can see here, using that sort of prescribed 4 years sounds like a really short fire return interval, and indeed is for a lot of ecosystems. But here, 4 years is really an aberration, and it takes these systems out of overstory, scattered pine that are favorable habitat for lots of stuff, and just erases the herbaceous cover that so many species, whether it's butterflies or ground nesting birds, would utilize. So much more of a woodlot, and in a lot of ways, even though it's just 4 years, it has a lot of the characteristics that the 60 years of no fire has. So it's really interesting in that way.